We're here because free speech is under attack. We're here because people are being convinced that socialism works. We're here because people are being judged guilty until proven innocent. We are fighting back with facts. This is not a safe zone, so buckle up, Buttercup. This is the raw, naked truth. Welcome to the Raw Naked Truth. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin, and with me today is special guest Bill Correll. Bill is host of our sister podcast, Lighting the Candle, and he's got a few other projects in the works for the Exvadio Podcast Network, and we're glad to have him on board today.
Good to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So, today, we are talking about CRT. And the reason we're returning to CRT is because of something that went on in Mississippi. The Mississippi State House passed a law. Now, I'm going to read you this law right from its own text, because I don't want there to be any misunderstanding about what this is about. The proposed legislation stated, no public institution of higher learning, community/junior college, school district, or public school, including public charter schools, shall direct or otherwise compel students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere to any of the following tenets. A, that any sex, race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin is inherently superior or inferior. Or B, that individuals should be adversely treated on the basis of their sex, race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin. Now, that sounds pretty good to me. In fact, it sounds like it comes right out of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. But what happened when this hit the floor was all 14 Black Democrat senators walked out before the vote could be held. And the only two votes against this were the two remaining Democrats. And it was all based on they did not want CRT excluded from schools. Now, people have mentioned this on the news, and it has become very obvious that most of the folks talking about this don't actually understand what CRT is. So that's where we're going with this. We're not going to talk about if Mississippi was right or wrong to do this. We are going to talk about what CRT is and how you can find out more about it for yourself. And Bill has done a lot of research on this. So Bill, I'm going to toss it over to you. Where do you start with this?
I don't know. That was very interesting for me. What I wanted to do was to go and find out what in fact CRT was. So I started doing some YouTube searches, and I found hundreds of different things that I could watch. So I kind of limited myself at the beginning to anything that was less than 5 or 6 minutes long, just so I could like skim across the surface and see what, it looked like somebody who knew what they were talking about. So I guess I'm going to tell you, my version of what I studied. And I've got hundreds of hours of reading and watching videos and listening to a dozen or more, maybe 20 different people speaking. And it did start in discussion among law professors 45 to 50 years ago. And they were kind of noodling the idea, from writings that came from the early part of the 20th century and the late part of the 18th century, post-Marxist, right? And so they more or less took on this academic conversation of a hypothesis that despite all the efforts since ending slavery to level the playing field for Blacks in our country, there was still specific inequity demonstrated in law enforcement, schooling, business, and government in general. So that seems like a pretty good place to start a conversation and ask questions, don't you think? I would agree.
It is, yes.
And so then there's all of these ancillary, let me put it to you this way. You can go down a lot of rabbit holes here. There's the rabbit hole that says, well, how are they doing, prior to the Equal Voting Rights Act? How are they doing, prior to the other things, with the Great Society in the 1960s? How were they doing before the interstate system came in and destroyed neighborhoods and divided people on one side of an interstate highway and the other side? So that's a whole study in and of itself. But what I want to say is that as far as the academic side is concerned, through the 1990s and the 2000s, there have been many books and papers written further discussing the opinions about this academic theory, a theory. And I think you could probably look at the timing of it to some key things happening in the news, like the early 1990s, coincidentally was around the time that Rodney King was beaten and the video came up. And we've seen it again and again through 2012, 2013, and the most recent writings. And I'm not going to mention the writers' names on here because it's just too many. And it's kind of like going to a Chinese buffet where each place has its own way of making hot and sour soup, say. No two recipes are exactly the same, but the theme and the fundamental principles of that, they're there. So all of these flavors distill down to some basic design principles as well. And the theory states as a truth, like this is not up for negotiation, racism is baked into all society. I mean, does that communicate, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I find that very troubling because that's an assumption that really there should be exploration into, there should be experimentation to see if it's actually true. But most of the writers that I've come across on CRT start with that point as non-negotiable.
100%. And you have to have, come on, Siri, give me a break. So you have to have a mother of all statements for any theory, correct?
Right.
And a theory is not necessarily something that's been proven. It's something that seems like there's a preponderance of evidence for, but maybe we haven't really given it the real acid test. So that theory that since it's like the air that we breathe here, it's all around, it's invisible, it's visible. Sometimes, there's no sort of neutral system. It's just a guise for racial power. And so, example, Brown versus Board of Education, which a lot of people thought would make the separate but equal go away, and that everybody's being educated in the same places at the same time by the same teachers, that would make things better for Black people. Affirmative action, equal rights legislation, and those were also, in fact, ways that critical race theory would say white community continues to maintain its supremacy and domination to persist. So in further, it was a way to leverage its own power, this white supremacist invisible nation that nobody really can acknowledge anymore, like the language. We're speaking English. There's nobody here that examines what English is all about anymore. We just talk, and then people either understand or they don't. So it was never about creating any type of equality.
Something went wrong.
Or
please try again.
Excuse me one second. Okay, so it never was about any leveling the playing field. It was, according to CRT, it was always one more way for white people and the white system and the white supremacist, invisible empire to maintain its leverage and continue to persist.
So wait a minute, I want to touch on that a moment, because I want to make sure we've got this clear for our listeners. According to CRT, things like Brown versus Board of Education, like affirmative action, these were not meant to help African Americans. They were a way for white supremacists to continue to hold them down.
100%. And with good reason, according to CRT. that the only way to subjugate a population is to continually show them that they are getting benefit for being in your culture. So these are cookies, according to CRT. These were not earth-shattering things that were intended to finally just be equal. But the interesting part is when that period of time, that 20 to 30 years, and this so-called leveraging the power, and so all forms of capitalism and meritocracy are just guises for power, and therefore any disparity is equal to racism. And in fact, power and racism change their definitions in CRT. When you hear somebody being referred to as a white supremacist, they're not talking about people who traditionally would belong to the skinheads, or they would belong to the KKK or any overt group like that. They're talking about any institutional structure that is based on anything that was originally intended to maximize the outcomes for so-called white people, or the people with the money, right?
Well, I think at this point, it's gone beyond just institutions. I mean, remember, it was just recently in the California gubernatorial recall election that CRT proponents called Larry Elder, a very prominent African-American radio host, the blackface of white supremacy.
And you know what they were doing is they were standing inside of the CRT definition, so that when you hear people like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and all those kind of people talk about racism, they're talking power, okay? They're not talking about people whose ethnicity is African. And in fact, it doesn't have anything to do with that. So what's real interesting here, whenever you see a statistic where Black people or the oppressed, you got to work with me here. We're not talking Black anymore. We're talking power, right? Whenever there is an oppressed person who is underperforming an oppressor, then that is the cause for explicit reason, and it is racism, okay? So there's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's either this or it's that. It's either Black or it's, not. It's either white and racist, or it's not, right?
Exactly. And it's gotten to the point where people are just falling back on this racist argument. Just had a city councilwoman from New York tweet about how the whole point of the police was to keep slaves in check, and therefore the institution can't possibly progress past where it was almost 200 years ago. It's the same group of people, and it has to be disbanded.
100%. And this argument doesn't need to have any factual basis. The argument is present simply because the theory states that, all of these systems were set up by white people to favor white people, and therefore white people now have a duty. The white people have a duty that all of these things have to be torn down in order to achieve racial equity and to change the standard. And that is to alleviate the racism that is inherent in those systems and can't be removed surgically. It has to be destroyed, flattened out, and rebuilt from nothing.
Right. Now, of course, by destroying an institution and rebuilding from scratch, essentially what it does is it gives the people who are pushing this agenda the ability to remake institutions in their own image so they can grab the power.
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't know that in CRT is particularly, that's what it's about, as much as that's what people are using it for.
Right.
If you pick up a hammer and you try to use it for something other than it's intended for, there could be some pretty drastic, consequences. But where we can take this and we can say it can be spoon-fed to people a little bit at a time, because there's no argument that historically most, and we could even stipulate 150, 200 years ago, all Black people had a horrible life, and for the most part, not much fun, etc.
Yep.
So now we'll project that onto our school kids today, And we'll say, well, if they're Black children and they're in a white experience school, the white kids have privilege because the system was built for them. And therefore, we have to change the standard around each and every observance of disparity. And this sells